Welcome, everyone. My name is Katie Estrada, and I am the Executive Director of Classy, and I'm excited to have all of you join us tonight. And for anyone this is their first webinar, a special welcome. Classy does host monthly free webinars focusing on a different topic each month. And each of our webinars are recorded, and we will distribute a link afterwards. So if you miss anything or just want to watch the presentation again, you will have that opportunity. And we are very excited to welcome Sue Trautman with us. She's going to be facilitating a 6-webinar series over the next few months, and we're delighted to have her. A little background on Sue. Sue has had a passion for AIR's sensory integration throughout her career and has been highly invested in teaching others throughout the world about this valuable theory, assessment process, and intervention. She is closely involved with the AIR's Sensory Integration 2020 vision, assisting with the development of easy test materials, coordination of field and pilot testing for the easy, and is also an instructor with Classy. Sue founded and worked until 2018 at the Center for Developing Kids in Pasadena, California. And we're excited to have Sue here today and also for the 6 series, 6 sessions. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Sue.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Well, welcome, everyone. I am thrilled to be here, and this particular webinar, as Katie mentioned, is the first in a series of what I'm calling the 6 help webinars, and these are intended to support the Classy modules 3, 4, and 5. And at the end of this webinar, there will be a list of the future titles and the dates for the remaining 5. But before we begin, for those of you who are comfortable, if you could please type in which module you have completed and the country that you're from, I will have an idea of who's in the room. Okay, thank you. It looks like we have people from all modules, and so I hope that whatever I present here will be meaningful to all of you, and I have structured it so that you can basically see the process that I go through to look at test scores and determine how the tests are related, how to come to a hypothesis, and a conclusion that's meaningful. So I'm just going to take you through my process, and you can see how I think it through. And then perhaps there'll be a different way that you'll do it, but this is how we're going to begin. So let's see here. Okay. So the very first thing that I always have in my mind is this is AIR's original model, and you can see that the senses are on the left, and integration of their inputs results in end products. This model still holds true today, and it is still something that I can refer back to and feel really comfortable with it. But over the years, there have been many, many more studies and have filled in this model. So since 1965, Dr. Ayers has been doing studies, and there have been many more that over the years that have determined that there are certain patterns that have emerged or areas that keep re-emerging over and over again, and these are motor planning, visual perception plus visual praxis, vestibular, postural, and bilateral problems, tactile defensiveness, and somatosensory perception. So I am going to go through, again, as I mentioned, my process, and I'll probably spend maybe 20, 30 minutes on this, and then following that, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, we can have a dialogue, and then about 5 minutes before the end, I'll make sure to show you my contact information and the other webinars. Okay, so let's see. This, if you have not taken modules 4 or 5, you may not be familiar with this interpretation tool. However, this is something that we use throughout all of the courses and related to our data-driven decision-making process. And so before going into the problems in sensory perception here, I just want to orient you to this tool and show you that the SIPT test scores are in, they have blue triangles next to them, and then the EASY tests are with purple stars, and the sensory processing measure has little red kind of circles. Now, there are many more easy tests that we do use, but for modules 3 and on, we have required just a certain amount of the easy tests that will be out in 2020, and we chose those because they are nice supplements to our existing information that we get from the SIPT and the SPM and the clinical observations. So let's see, the way that this tool is set up is that you can see that, like Ayer's model, the sensory systems are across the top. Actually, hers are on the side, but we focus in on vestibular processing, proprioception, tactile perception, and visual perception. And we can look at simply the sensory systems to determine any problems we might have in sensory perception. We also can look at this in somewhat a linear way, although, of course, nothing is that straightforward, but we know that the vestibular system and the proprioceptive system have an impact on postural and motor or praxis and motor related problems and functions, and that the vestibular system influences postural and ocular control, bilateral skills, midline skills, and the proprioceptive system also impacts postural mechanisms, and the two systems work really closely together. So that's how we have this set up on this particular tool. And then we also look at proprioception and tactile perception as having a relationship to each other. So just like proprioception and vestibular perception have a relationship to each other, proprioception and tactile perception are closely linked. And they also impact postural mechanisms and have an impact on somatosensory-based praxis. We look at language-based praxis, and with the EASY, we're looking at problems in ideation-based praxis. The tool also shows us visual perception and and visual praxis, and looks at problems in visual-based praxis. So what we needed to do was to take all of this information that we've been getting from not only from Ayer's original work, but from all of those studies that I mentioned, and we needed to find a way to organize our information. And that is why we developed this tool, because once you get testing, as you know, there's a lot of things to consider, not only just in your test scores, but you've got to think about many other things such as the parent report and the SPM and your clinical observations, and you're all nervous about testing, and we really need to have a way to organize all of our information. So that was the purpose of the development of this tool. We also put on the tool sensory reactivity, and this is a little bit off to the side, as you can see, and it's kind of a separate area. This is purposeful because sensory reactivity and sensory perception are they're different. And I should let you know that that will be a topic, I think it's the third webinar in, because this is often very confusing for therapists, it's confusing for parents, because they find that their child is having a lot of sensory concerns, but then when you test the sensory perception, it either completely matches up or it doesn't match up, and it's difficult for therapists to really determine what is really going on. So what I'd like to do is, with that orientation, is I'm going to start with the bar graph of a SIP, because I believe that not all of you, but almost every one of you have had the opportunity to use the SIP, and so this is how I do it, and you can decide if it works for you, but it works for me. So, okay. So a couple of things I'd like to point out on this bar graph that is confusing sometimes to participants is that average scores are between -1 and 1, as you can see on this graph, or about 12% to, I don't know, about 85% or so. So some of the things that I'm going to be bringing up in this talk are things that have been common questions or concerns of people throughout the courses that I've taught over the years. And one of them is that for some reason, sometimes people think that if it's below 0 on this bar graph, that it actually is below average, and that is not the case. So if you would look about, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, down to graphesthesia, it's the 6th test score down, you can see that that is a -0.24, and that is still within the average range. The same, it could be said, for design copying at -0.33. Let's see what else we have. Okay, and then we have postural praxis, and that is -0.91. That is still within average. Sometimes I might look at that knowing that it's kind of approaching the borderline if I had a lot of other scores that I was concerned about that seemed similar, but it's still an average score, and so is sequencing praxis at -0.29. So, I'm always very excited actually when I get the bar graph, because you put all this work in and you put all your scores in, and finally you have the results. But this is really only the beginning. And what I'd like to teach all of you is I'd like to help you become more comfortable with just looking at these tests and thinking about the relationships of the tests to each other, or looking at any test, if it's on the easy, if it's related, if it's another test completely different. But once you start becoming comfortable with the constructs or what the test is actually measuring, your speed and your accuracy of interpretation will really improve. And obviously, that's really what we want, right? And it will also help you understand function and help you with your hypothesis and your goals and completing that the whole process until you're able to help the child through communication with the parents or the teacher. So let's start here with this bar graph. Okay, so I see that we have some low scores, kinesthesia, localization of tactile stimuli, oral praxis, bilateral motor coordination, standing and walking balance, motor accuracy, and post-rotary nystagmus. And I notice that for the most part, it looks like the visual scores are pretty good. The top 4 scores, which and some of them are above average, which would be space visualization and manual form perception being just above 1, they all have a visual component. So that's interesting to me. So what I've done is I put these into, again, going back to the sensory systems, and this is just my way of thinking. I usually either do this in my head, or I might do it on paper, but especially if it's confusing, I would do it on paper. But all of the low scores that I just mentioned are listed here with the initials in these ovals. So let's just go through them and practice understanding the constructs of these tests and why they're related to each other and why I put them here. Okay, so if we look at PRN, that is pretty much a measurement of the vestibular ocular reflex. So that means that there is a visual component to it, but it really primarily, I think of this test as a vestibular test. So I popped that over into the vestibular section for now anyway, and then I looked at another test and I saw, okay, on the bar graph, standing and walking balance was low. Well, you know, that's a static and dynamic test, meaning that if you go think about the test items, sometimes the child is balancing on just on their foot, sometimes they're balancing on a dowel, sometimes they're walking heel to toe. So there's this dynamic and static component to it. And sometimes their eyes are closed and sometimes their eyes are open. And so therefore I'm thinking, okay, this really has vestibular and proprioception as really criteria, I guess, to participate in this test successfully. You really need to use those 2 senses. Then, if you look at bilateral motor coordination, this is an interesting test because one thing that I think about this test is that it is primarily with your upper body, your arms. And it doesn't involve the entire body, but it involves smoothness of motion. So that is a key element of this test, that you are assessing smoothness of motion. So that to me says, okay, you know, we're really talking about awareness of your body in space. I think there's some proprioception involved in this test. But, you know, I know from theory, and I actually know from a lot of the studies that I've looked at, that crossing the midline and bilateral motor coordination are related to vestibular processing. And so that's why I have that in that overlap section. Okay, then there's kinesthesia. This is another test that is really limited to the arms, and the vision is occluded, so it's pretty clear that, to me anyhow, that the main place that this would go and would be proprioception because it's body awareness without using your vision. But there's also the opportunity to look at clinical observations. For many of you, I'm sure it happened where you were testing the child and you literally had to drag their arm across the table. So what does this tell you? Well, it could be that the child has really low muscle tone. It could be that they are really unaware of their body and space. Anyhow, these are the things that you think about. And then, if we look at oral praxis, I put that between proprioceptive and tactile because this test is really unique. This test, the child cannot see what they're doing. So they have to rely completely on their proprioceptive system and their tactile system. It's also a bilateral test, so it might end up having something to do with, bilateral and midline skills as well. But I decided for now to put it under proprioceptive and tactile. And then the last low test, well, not the last low test, but another low test is localization of tactile stimuli. And that test, I'm looking at that and thinking, okay, it's the only tactile test that's low. I'm really curious to find out more about other tactile tests and see if they're low. And then I think, this is a pure touch perception test, but that's the last test that's administered in the SIPT. And I'm wondering, I want to look at the other test scores because I want to see if maybe this was impacted by other factors. Okay, there's one other test score that's low, and this is motor accuracy. If you remember that all the other visual test scores were high. Motor accuracy requires eye-hand coordination. It requires crossing the midline. It's a bilateral test from the standpoint that you do left and right. And I'm starting to think that it might have more of a relationship to the vestibular system. And I'm also thinking that because I also know that there are patterns that are related to, that the motor accuracy test falls into that particular bilateral integration and sequencing pattern. So we need to do more, though. I told you I was curious about some of these tests, and so this is what I do. I automatically, right after I look at the bar graph and go through this little mental process, I turn to page 4 of the WPS test report because it is so full of great information about all of these different tests. So I can look at the first two, space visualization and figure ground, and see those two visual tests are fine. Sometimes you'll see unusual things with the time scores, and we'll probably talk about this in another webinar when we talk about visual praxis. But that looks fine. And then I look at manual form perception, and if you think about this test, it's really, part 1 is very much visual. And let's see, there's a lot of scores here, but part 1, accuracy, it's tactile and visual, and that is quite average. And then if you look at part 2, accuracy, that's even a little bit above average. And if you think about part 2, that's where the child is feeling things with both hands, and they're using a lot of touch perception. So I'm getting a little bit more information about touch perception, especially when I look at some of the other touch perception tests, thinking, maybe LTS, maybe that was just because it was the last test. I don't know, but I'm thinking I'm not quite so worried about LTS because of the support of manual form perception, and then jumping down past kinesthesia, finger identification, and graphesthesia. And there's nothing really odd about kinesthesia. let's see, practice on verbal command. If we go up to design copying, you're going to see that there is some low scores. Even though the average score, the asterisk score is the one that is on the bar graph. So now I'm going to want to know a little bit more about design copying, and I will find that out when I look at the next page, page 5, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Okay, constructional praxis. Here's another nice test score that's a visual test that seems okay, or is okay. We have postural praxis. You know, maybe I'll look at that later for borderline. Oral praxis, we already mentioned, was low. Sequencing, nothing odd is going on there. Bilateral motor coordination, nothing unusual is going on there. But I look at standing and walking balance, and I say, well, it looks like eyes open was okay, but eyes closed, which was more of a challenge, significantly more of a challenge for the child. So that tells me that, you know, maybe it was more the vestibular part of the vestibular demands of the test that was difficult for the child. And so in my mind, I'm going to put that on my little ovals in my mind or on paper. And nothing else unusual going with motor accuracy or with post-sorting nystagmus. So let's go to page 5, and there you go. You have some problems with design copying where you see some of these part scores that may or may not be related to vestibular, but I'm a little bit wondering, especially about the reversals, because the vestibular system is instrumental in telling us what direction we are, if we're up or we're down, and so, you know, there's maybe a relationship there. I'm thinking jogs and distortions might be related to all of these sensory systems really supporting praxis and boundaries, spatial relations. So now I've wrapped my head around this bar graph, and I'm feeling like motor accuracy. I'm going to cross that out under the visual, and I'm going to move it over to vestibular again, at least for now, as far as I've gone, and I'm going to make these other notes. But then, okay, then I need to also consider the easy, and I need to consider the sensory processing measure. Now my mind's getting really boggled, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got easy scores now, I've got SPM, I've got the conversation from the parent, I have my observations that I made during testing, which you can use this particular chart that we developed for you to look at the behavioral signs, and just so you can kind of keep adding to your whole hypothesis and just building and building until you're trying to figure out what is going on with this child. Now, at this point, I am desperate for the interpretation tool. I need it really badly. And so I start putting my scores, I start transferring the scores from the SIPT, from the easy. You'll notice that there are little part scores in there, and I start thinking about what was difficult, what are areas of strength, and I'm really happy to have a way to visualize this all together in a group. Okay, so let's see. So now I can look here, and I can see that primarily it looks to me like this child's problems are in vestibular bilateral integration, and that there are some problems with reactivity. Now, and just another word about this chart. This chart was built from a theoretical perspective, but really it was really developed based on all of those years of studies that involve factor and cluster analysis. So you can have confidence that this chart is correctly set up and aligned with the tests in the correct places. So I just wanted to let you know that this just wasn't willy-nilly. We really kind of spent a lot of time determining what went where based on data. Okay, so now I take my test scores and I can really get into data-driven decision-making and hypothesis generation. So the low scores that were first on the bar graph, then on my little ovals, then on the interpretation tool, now are here, and they also should include, yes, they include some of the easy tests and the clinical observations, and these tests, this whole picture demonstrates it's a recognizable pattern of low scores that suggests inefficient processing of vestibular and proprioceptive sensory information. And I put in parentheses the vestibular, bilateral integration, and sequencing. So right now I'm still looking at the challenges. I'm really, I think as therapists, we're really focused on first looking at the problems, and so I want to look at what did I find out from the sensory processing measure. And I found out that there were problems with attention and social participation, visual reactivity. And so my hypothesis was that this is not surprising, but that problems with attention, regulation, and organization frequently coexist with this type of sensory integrated dysfunction. Now, if you look at those assessment results and you come up with my hypothesis, and the hypotheses, now it's really critical for me to pull it back to what were the referring problems, which I have not shared with you at this point. But this doesn't mean a whole lot unless I can go back to a parent and teacher and say, I found something out and it seems related to your referring problems. So these are the referring problems of this particular child. And these particular challenges are related to this particular pattern of bilateral integration and sequencing. Now, this isn't a perfectly easy one, other than the fact that they fell perfectly into the pattern, all the scores did, because there's many other things that are commonly associated with that bilateral integration and sequencing pattern, such as clumsy, maybe, it's often children have difficulty riding a bike, or they show poor coordination, or basically their bilateral skills aren't really strong, or they may stumble or fall into people, or, there could have been a lot of other clinical observations that would have been a little bit easier for me to say this is related. But I do know that the disorganization and the decreased attention, with this particular child does have something to do with her ability to sit still in her chair and feel comfortable in her chair, because she's really looking to move a lot, to stay alert and organized, and that it's really difficult for her to have the smoothness of movement for her writing and to stay organized. And the other problem for her was just remaining calm with peer interaction, because she really, really was interested in her peers. So I have I've come up with this hypothesis based on the scores and really with help of the interpretation chart, but now I really want to look at the strengths as well. So these are the strengths from that SIPT bar graph, and you can see what they are. If you're not familiar with some of the abbreviations, you will be as you keep doing this, but this particular child has visual strengths and interest in many types of activities, and my hypothesis is that that would allow for use of a broad range of therapeutic sensory integrative activities while she was in therapy. And to me, this was really important, and I was actually very excited to begin working with her. I actually treated this girl, and it was just really fun to have someone who had this really significant strength and then yet these other challenges. And then the other wonderful thing was that she had strong communication skills. So this child was 7, I think, but she was old enough to actually help with setting goals. And, you know, I think you can even do that with a lot of younger children on a very different level. But she also had good creativity, and she was friendly, but she was really, really concerned about her ability to manage her sensory systems at school. But this ideation ability, I knew would help increase her involvement in the therapy process. So that was really quite exciting to me as well. And that's pretty much where I'm going to end. And we'll open it up now for questions. I think it's, let me just see if that's left. Yeah, so questions, and then in a little bit I'll show you my contact information in the other webinars. So what can I help you with? All right, let me see. And if you don't need help, I can give you some more information. How are the new testers feeling about testing? Okay, I don't think I see any questions coming in. Just double check here. All right. Okay. So, all right. So the main, if there are no other questions, then I will keep trying to glance back at the chat box and make sure I don't miss anything. But what we can do is we can go back to, oh, I see a question coming. But we'll go back to the page 4. Okay, Cynthia, well, Jan, there's someone else typing, but Cynthia mentioned that people have thought easy would be simple to administer, and she's mentioning that we have to do all the detailed steps to get the information needed for a full assessment. I have been very involved in the development of EASY. I was lucky to play with it and practice and try it out on all kinds of children in the clinic that I owned before I turned it over to other people. And the scoring is a lot easier. The purpose of the scoring was to, almost all the scores are in a 0, 2, or a 1. But as we got going with easy, we realized that it was really critical that we didn't miss having a full comprehensive assessment. So it's not going to be a short assessment. It probably won't be as long as the SIFT. We're still in the process of we're just beginning normative data collection. So it's, with the normative data collection, we may end up shortening the easy a little bit, but we do feel pretty strongly about having a comprehensive assessment. Okay. Jan says, thank you for this presentation. I'm curious about the slide when you put MEDI tests under vestibular. It seems that they also have proprioceptive components, and putting them under both vestibular and proprioceptive could still lead to VBI in the end. You're probably right about that. I can try and find that slide. Let me just go back. I'm going to pop back. I don't know any other way to do it than this way. I don't know if this is the slide you're talking about, Jan, but you're right, motor accuracy has a proprioceptive component, but SWB, eyes closed, is really probably more related to vestibular, and then design copying, also has a visual component. So, these are things that, I feel pretty confident, though, about those tests under vestibular that I've got there. Okay. Let's see what else we have here. We have, okay, Jan, let's see, Stacy. I'm only familiar with the SPM, but I'm interested in the SIPT because it feels like the parent report is not always accurate. They're different. The SPM is incredibly valuable because it's the perception of the parent, and that is accurate to them, and it's also accurate to the teacher in the event that the teacher fills one out. And so I love having them because they are the perception, whereas the SIPT, I shouldn't say perception, that's not good. It's the parents' ideas and what they believe that they're seeing. The SIPT is actually, hard data as to how the child is actually perceiving sensory stimuli. And so in our third webinar, we're going to be talking about those differences a little bit more, because sometimes a child could have reactivity that might be picked up on the SPM, but they might have a typical SIPT or vice versa, and we'll get into that. So you're right, there's often differences, but that's really informative. So I think that's pretty cool, actually. I like it. Stacy said, yes, I did that. It was extremely different. That makes sense, though. But when you try to provide strategies, and they're saying there's no issues in a certain area, for that, what I do, Stacy, is I just focus on what they're most worried about. And once I have a trust relationship, I feel more confident about being able to bring up other things that might be seen. The other thing is that parents, often the SPM will look worse as parents or teachers get more informed, because they start really recognizing a lot of the issues. So I try and stick with their presenting concerns and go with that. That's been my most success, because the idea is really to get in there and just get everybody comfortable and help and, just really to help the child. So, yeah, that's what I do. Okay. Looks like Marco is typing. Yeah, so he says it also helps to give SPM to teachers. Sometimes it's good to show parents that there's a problem in school. And, I like that because what happens is instead of saying, oh, well, the parent doesn't see it, but the teacher does, I turn it into a positive situation and say, wow, tell me, parent, what you're doing at home that's really working for you so it can be used in the school. Or tell me, teacher, what kind of strategies are so helpful or so difficult so we can, kind of bridge the gap. And, home and school are very, very different. So that is sometimes what's going on there. Yeah. Thank you, Marco. He said that's a great way to approach it. I've really found it's really non-threatening to do that and just say, wow, look at the difference. And, I'm sure for those of you that have given the SPM to mothers and fathers, they're usually quite different. That doesn't always go quite as well with, look at how different you are, but the home to the teacher is really a nice bridge. Okay. Cynthia's asking if I can talk through some of the first few treatment activities that you use with this case. I can tell you how I generally begin treatment, and I think I will reserve the intervention piece for another a webinar because that can get really involved. But the very first, I obviously with this girl would probably use vestibular and proprioceptive input, and because she had such great ideation and and interest and desire, I would use some usually creative, fun activities that she helped me create, such as play. Very playful. But what I usually do is it's my style. I usually start out my session on a swing, face-to-face, on the big standard glider, and I talk to this child and just say, I just try and get a sense of where they're at, if they're really, really up high. I do a lot of intense vestibular. I start where they're at and then I bring them down. But with her, the goal clearly is to get integration of her proprioceptive and vestibular systems. So I'm working at a really kind of low level and using high level activities with her. Okay. I hope that answered you enough, Cynthia, but I know people are hungry for treatment ideas, and I will get there at a later date. I just think we don't quite have enough time to do that right now. So any other questions before I go into the webinars? The next webinar is just the plan. Happy to take a few more. Do you feel you have a lot of kids that it is hard to make this thinking? Oh, I'm not sure I understand you, Marco. A lot of kids that it's hard. That's all right. He feels that what is harder with more severe kids? Oh, the ideation piece, maybe? Okay. Let me see if I know. Okay. So, all right, the kids that are more involved, if I had a more involved case, let's say a child that showed up with a similar profile, although usually the profile that I presented you today is one of the milder profiles. But if I did have a more involved profile, a child who was much more involved, I still tend to start out with vestibular proprioceptive activities, and even the nonverbal children, I try and really create a bond of trust. Like, my main goal in the first many sessions is just to create trust. So I don't worry about anything other than really getting to know and love that child. And then from there, I start adding on the adaptive responses, adding, upping the ante, adding on the challenges wherever they're at. And I've just found that the type of activities we use in sensory integration are just so motivating. So a very simple activity would be, maybe a child would be on a swing batting a ball, or just standing up and smacking a ball with swinging or something like that. I mean, just to get the bilateral piece. Or they might just be pulling themselves up a ramp or pulling themselves on a scooter. So, I just really start with where they're at. And I don't know if that answered it, but when they have everything, that's actually great. Not great, but it's easier for treatment, because you can work on a lot of intense sensory, well, it depends if you need to make it intense or not, but sensory input that's really goal-directed. And even children who are quite involved, you can usually get them to, pat at a beach ball, or throw a beanbag, or push against your hands, or just sit on you with a swing, and just start to get to know each other and go from there. Okay? All right, guys. I'm going to move on, and I hope to, because I said I would. Yeah, more foundational work. Yeah, we're really lucky. We're so fortunate that we get to have this wonderful intervention that's based on a solid assessment, and know where to go, and at least know where our endpoint is. So, okay. All right, so here is my plan for the next group of webinars. And you can see that the next one is not going to be quite as clear-cut. So I'm going to do a similar method, because as I mentioned, it's what I know, it's what I feel comfortable with, and I'm going to maybe do a few things differently, but I'm not going to have a nice, easy, perfect little profile this time, and I'm going to try and we're going to work together and figure out, what does this really mean? We'll probably just do a similar method to reinforce what we've learned today. And then one of the things that we're going to look at on August 6th is reactivity or perception, because this is a real area of confusion for so many people. And again, I think we need practice, because what we have to do is we need to learn for webinar 4 or sooner to get confidence on what you're going to say to the parents or teacher. Because that's a tough one. Sensory integration, we already know, is not easy to explain. And so the more we feel confident about the test scores, how the tests are related to each other, which is how it's related to their function, then we can say, when they had, how you said they keep falling down and they're always bumping into other kids, I discovered that, in fact, their test scores support what you say, and that's absolutely true. And from what we know from our studies and research, it looks like we can really address this with this intervention, because and then you would go further and explain about the intervention, which we will do later as well. And then the other thing that I've heard in many of the classes that I've taught are that people don't have time, they don't have the materials, and they don't have funding. And so how can they possibly get a comprehensive assessment? I would like to try and address that with all of you, because one of the things I don't think I said, or it was said in my bio, is that I've spent a lot of time in schools. The company that I worked at, I was probably in schools for many years, at least 2 mornings a week, and for years and years, maybe sometimes more. And then we also had an early intervention program, and we had kids coming on insurance, we had kids, we were going into homes, and so with all of these different environments, I realized that sometimes you really, really need to get creative. And not only that, funding is always changing, and therapists are really, really hard workers, is how I've seen it, and so they're putting in a lot of time. And so I just want to help you not ever give up your comprehensive assessment, and I'm going to help you find a way to at least get as much in as possible to meet your needs, is my plan. And then finally, one of the other things that I have experience in is I've developed a lot of spaces for intervention. I developed a lot of the school spaces. I've done a little bit in homes. I've built out on the company that I founded. I built out, I think, 6 times. So I have some ideas on how to get started with intervention, and I would love to share that with you. I know people are all over the world in many, many different areas, and it can be really difficult. So that will be a fun discussion. I think a lot of these will be a fun discussion. The next 2 will be a little bit more practice, I think, and the last 3 are going to probably involve a little more discussion. So I hope to see you all there at these next ones. I so appreciate all of you who have come from around the world and have come at various times. And I wanted to give you my contact information, so I'm more than happy to answer any questions after this webinar. You can feel free to email me. If you do email me, if you can please just let me know like where you are from, if you've met me before, if you were in one of my classes, what module you're in, because that will help me. I have primarily taught modules 2 through 6. So those are probably my strength areas, and I would be more than happy to speak with any of you at any time. Okay? You're welcome, everyone. I love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Sue. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And for everyone in the room, we will be sending out a link in the coming days so that you can watch this again. And thanks so much for joining us.
Okay, and Katie, one question was if the webinars were going to be at the same time as today, and yes, they will be.
Yes, 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time.
Okay.
Time for the webinar.
All right, everybody. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening. All right, bye. Bye. Bye-bye.